This is not a story about a typical crime. In the spring of 2016, in a quiet neighborhood in Spokane, Washington, police walked into a home where a seemingly ordinary family lived: a grandmother, a granddaughter, and a 20-year-old grandson with Down syndrome. Behind the walls, something was happening that most people would rather never know about. The sister had slowly crossed a line and began to form a relationship with her brother that had no right to exist. This secret connection grew over months until it erupted and ended in murder. Spring 2016 began normally for the Henson family. The house on the outskirts of Spokane looked well kept. The yard was tidy, and a bed was being prepared in the garden for the first plantings. Grandma Margaret continued her usual chores: morning shopping, cooking, caring for the grandchildren. Linda, 22, worked part-time at a local supermarket. Michael, 20, stayed home, occasionally helping his grandmother with the housework. But by mid-March, changes began to creep into the usual rhythm. Linda increasingly refused to leave the house during her free time, spending her evenings in her room. Michael, who used to like to sit in the living room and watch TV, was increasingly near his sister. Grandma explained this by the fact that they had developed a special closeness as relatives. The first signs that something was changing in the house could be detected in small details. According to neighbors, Linda and Michael began to spend more time in the backyard, talking quietly, away from their grandmother. In the evening, their silhouettes could be seen near the wall of the garage, standing close to each other and talking in low voices. The neighbors did not attach any importance to this at the time. The atmosphere inside the house was becoming tense. Margaret began to notice that Linda had become irritable in response to simple requests. Whereas before her granddaughter had calmly helped around the house, she now responded that she was busy or not in the mood. Michael had also changed. He became more silent, communicated less with his grandmother, and, as she herself noted, began to stick to his sister. About a month before the incident, the first loud conflict occurred. In the evening, Grandma returned from shopping and found that Linda's door was closed. When she knocked, Linda answered irritably, saying that she did not want to talk. Later, Margaret noticed that Michael was in the room too. The conversation between them stopped immediately after she appeared. During this period, Linda practically stopped maintaining contacts outside the home. Her mobile phone, as the investigation would later establish, was used only for correspondence with several numbers. Data analysis showed that most of the messages had been deleted. The notebooks found after the tragedy contained personal notes, from which the investigators concluded that Linda was gradually developing an emotional and physical attachment to her brother. Small domestic conflicts began to accumulate in the house. Margaret insisted that the grandchildren spend more time in the living room and have dinner together, but Linda preferred to have dinner with Michael separately, in her room. She reacted sharply to her grandmother's attempts to intervene, sometimes raising her voice. A neighbor who lived across the fence later told investigators that about 2 weeks before the incident, she heard loud screams coming from Henson's house. According to her, it was Margaret's voice who was shouting, "This is not normal. I will not let this continue." The neighbor did not understand what exactly was being discussed and assumed it was a normal family quarrel. After this incident, Linda began to avoid her grandmother. Michael stayed with his sister almost constantly. The door to her room was increasingly closed. According to Margaret's testimony, she felt that she was losing control over the situation in the house, but did not know how to act. In the days leading up to the tragedy, tensions reached their breaking point. Linda stopped greeting her grandmother in the mornings, and Michael followed her even on short trips around the house. The evening before the incident, her grandmother returned from the kitchen to find them in the living room. The conversation stopped as soon as she entered. The atmosphere was tense, and both of their faces were tense. That night, neighbors again heard raised voices. According to them, Grandma spoke sharply and demandingly. Linda responded loudly with obvious irritation. The conflict lasted about half an hour, after which there was silence. It was the last night that the Henson house seemed outwardly calm. The morning of April 9th, 2016 began quietly in the Henson household. Grandma Margaret had made breakfast, but she was alone at the table. Linda and Michael did not emerge from their room. No one answered her knock. After a while, she heard footsteps and muffled voices, but the door did not open. During the day, Linda went into the kitchen twice, without looking at her grandmother, got food, and returned. Michael showed up only once to get a bottle of water. Margaret's attempt to talk to her grandson ended with a curt reply. Linda said, "We were busy." According to neighbors, none of the family left the yard that day. In the evening, screams were heard in the house again. The neighbor who heard them claimed that the tone was much sharper than before. She heard Margaret's voice saying, "I won't let you continue this." Linda's response was muffled, but her intonation was filled with anger. That evening, Margaret called an old friend in another area and told her that she was worried about her grandchildren. In the conversation, she mentioned that Linda was too close to Michael and that the situation was becoming unbearable. The friend suggested that she contact social services, but Margaret said she would try to sort it out on her own first. The morning of April 10th began with Linda loudly closing the door to her room. The grandmother went out into the hallway to ask where she and Michael were going, but received no answer. About an hour later, she tried to talk to her granddaughter again, but the door was locked. At lunchtime, Linda and Michael went out into the vegetable garden. They talked quietly, almost in a whisper. Margaret watched them from the kitchen window. Her anxiety grew. Michael was standing very close to his sister. She was holding his hand and saying something. A few minutes later, they returned to the house, and again the door of their room was closed. On the evening of April 10th, Linda stopped hiding her irritation. In the living room, she answered her grandmother's question about her plans for the next day sharply. "It's none of your business." Margaret tried to explain that she was worried, but Linda cut her off mid-sentence. Michael was sitting in the corner of the room at the time, avoiding his grandmother's gaze. According to the investigation, on the night of April 11th, Linda sent several messages from her phone. All of them were deleted, and it was not possible to restore their contents. Judging by the time of recording the activity, the correspondence was conducted from midnight to 3 o'clock in the morning. The morning of April 11th began with Linda and Michael leaving their room together and sitting in the living room. Margaret tried to make conversation, but Linda ignored her questions. The house had a cool, reserved air. Even mundane sounds, footsteps on the floor, running water, seemed loudly accentuated. Later that afternoon, Margaret and Linda had another argument. It was heard by a neighbor who described it as the worst yet. She said voices were raised, and at one point Linda shouted, "You're going to ruin everything." After that, the door to Linda's room was locked again, and no sounds were heard from there for the rest of the evening. On the evening of April 11th, Margaret called the same friend she had spoken to 2 days earlier. There was a lot of tension in the woman's voice. She said that she would resolve this issue today. The friend tried to dissuade her from taking drastic action, but Margaret ended the conversation. According to the data collected by the investigation, at about 9 p.m., the lights went out in the living room and kitchen. The only room that was lit was Linda's room. She and Michael were there. The conversation between them was quiet and abrupt. The grandmother approached the door several times but did not go inside. It was the last recorded quiet night in the Henson household. In the morning, the situation would take an irreversible turn. April 12, 2016, began with an unusual silence. Margaret usually got up around 7 a.m., turned on the radio in the kitchen, and began making breakfast. But on this day, the radio never played. According to the evidence obtained by investigators, she woke up earlier than usual, around 5 a.m., and spent several hours in her room, almost never leaving. Linda woke up around 9. She left the room and went straight to the bathroom. Michael stayed in bed, lying with his face pressed against the wall. Linda returned 20 minutes later, walking past her grandmother without saying a word. Margaret was in the kitchen at the time, standing at the stove, and, according to the neighbor, looking tense when she caught a glimpse of her through the window. Around 10 a.m., the women had their first argument of the day. Margaret walked into Linda's room, where Michael was at the time. The tone of the conversation quickly escalated. According to audio from a home security camera installed across the street, the camera recorded the sound when the windows were open. Margaret said, "You can't go on like this." Linda responded, "We'll decide for ourselves how to live." After that, Linda abruptly closed the door, leaving her grandmother in the hallway. The sound of the door slamming was clearly audible. Margaret stood there for a few seconds, then went into the kitchen. At 11:15, Linda and Michael left the room and went into the backyard. They sat on the porch steps, talking in low voices. Margaret watched them from the window. Her irritation was growing. Soon she went out into the yard and demanded that Michael come back into the house. He stood up, but Linda grabbed his arm and said, "He's staying with me." This was recorded by a neighbor who was in the garden. At noon, Linda and Michael returned inside. Margaret tried to talk again, but Linda ignored her. Michael sat in the corner of the living room, quietly staring at the floor. Grandma stood in front of Linda and spent several minutes talking about how this can't go on. At that point, Michael began nervously fiddling with the hem of his t-shirt. Around 1 p.m., Margaret went to her bedroom, but returned a few minutes later with a mobile phone. Experts later determined that she had called the county social services. but the call was dropped after 30 seconds. At 1:40 p.m., an incident occurred that would later be considered key to understanding the situation. Linda tried to close the door to her room from the inside, but Margaret prevented her by standing in the doorway. An argument ensued between them. Linda demanded that her grandmother leave them alone. Margaret insisted that Michael should sleep separately and spend more time outside his sister's room. At this point, Michael stood behind Linda, looking at the floor, not interfering. After this conversation, Linda and Michael went to their room. The door was closed. Margaret remained in the hallway. She stood there for about a minute, then went to the kitchen and began to wash the dishes. For the next 2 hours, there was little sound from Linda's room. At 4:10 p.m., she went into the kitchen, got 2 glasses, and came back. Margaret tried to talk, but Linda, without stopping, said, "We're busy." Later that evening, Margaret called her friend and said, "Today is the day to end it." Her friend again suggested involving social services, but Margaret replied, "If they come, it will only get worse." At 6 p.m., Linda and Michael went out into the backyard again. This time, Margaret followed them. The conversation between the women became heated. A neighbor who heard it claims that Margaret said, "You're breaking all the laws and regulations." Linda replied, "We're not bothering anyone." At 6:30 p.m., all 3 returned to the house. Linda and Michael went into the room. The door was closed. At 7 p.m., the light in the kitchen went out, and only a table lamp remained lit in the living room. The atmosphere inside the house was tense and quiet. According to the investigation, it was during this period of time that the situation reached a point from which there was no turning back. Linda and Michael were isolated, and the grandmother increasingly felt a loss of control. Any attempt at contact ended in conflict, and none of the participants in the events were ready for reconciliation. It was the last evening the 3 were in the house together. The next hours would lead to events that would make the crime news and become the subject of a high-profile trial. On the evening of April 12, 2016, at approximately 8:15 p.m., the Henson home was silent, except for the sound of the television coming from Margaret's bedroom. Linda and Michael were in her room with the door closed. According to a neighbor who was taking out the trash at the time, the house was dark except for a dim light coming from Linda's window. At 8:40 p.m., Linda went into the kitchen. She grabbed a bottle of water and returned without saying a word. Margaret watched from the living room. According to her testimony, later recorded in the case file, at that moment, she felt that the situation was getting completely out of control. At 9:10 p.m., Grandma came to Linda's door and knocked. There was no answer. She knocked again, louder. A few seconds later, the door opened and Linda appeared on the threshold. The conversation immediately began in raised tones. Margaret demanded that Michael leave and stay in the living room for the night. Linda refused. The verbal altercation lasted about 3 minutes and ended with Linda slamming the door. At 9:20 p.m., Margaret called her friend. The conversation was short. She said she was not going to put up with this for another night. Her friend replied that she would come in the morning to help sort things out, but Margaret said that by morning, everything will have changed. By 10 p.m., the house was almost completely quiet. The TV was off, and the only light came from a lamp in the hallway. At 10:15 p.m., a neighbor's outdoor camera recorded Linda leaving her room and heading to the bathroom. Michael remained inside. 7 minutes later, she returned. From 11 p.m. until midnight, muffled conversations could be heard coming from Linda's room. The words were inaudible, but the voices were tense. During this period, Margaret passed their doors several times, lingering in the hallway. At 00:05 on April 13th, Linda left the room again, went into the kitchen, turned on the light, and started looking for something in the drawer. A few minutes later, she returned holding an object that investigators later identified as a kitchen knife. At this point, according to the case, she had not yet performed any actions, but the fact that the object had been moved was noted as an important detail. From 00:30 to 01:10, the house remained immersed in silence. Neighbors who testified claimed that no noise was heard from their side during this time. Around 1:15 a.m., there was a brief but extremely heated argument between Linda and Margaret. According to reports, this was the only conflict of the night in which voices were actually raised. Margaret again demanded that Michael leave the room, to which Linda refused, accompanied by harsh words. At 01:25, the door to Linda's room slammed shut. Grandma remained in the hallway, then went into her bedroom. From 02:00 to 05, the morning in the house passed without any outward signs of conflict. Linda and Michael remained in their room. Margaret in hers. At 05:15, Linda got up, opened the window in her room, then closed it again. She looked out, stood for a few seconds, and then returned to her room. At 06:00, Margaret woke up completely and began her morning routine in the kitchen. She turned on the kettle and got out the breakfast ingredients. At 06:20, Linda came out of her room, walked past her grandmother in silence, and poured herself a coffee. Margaret tried to start a conversation, but Linda interrupted her with the phrase, "Today it will all end." These words, recorded in her testimony, became one of the key moments in the case. From 06:30 to 07, both women were in different parts of the house. Michael remained in his sister's room, sitting on the bed. At 07:10, activity began in the house, which attracted the attention of neighbors. They heard loud footsteps, doors opening and closing abruptly. At this point, according to the investigation, the conflict between Linda and Margaret entered its final stage. At 07:25, according to the official report, a series of events occurred that directly led to the death of one of the family members. Details of this moment were recorded by the police during the inspection of the scene and the testimony of the only surviving witness. By 7:45 a.m., the house was quiet for nearly an hour and a half before the first police officers entered. On April 13, 2016, at approximately 9:05 a.m., a 911 call came in from a neighbor of the Henson family. The woman reported hearing screams coming from the house, followed by a sudden silence. She noted that she had heard an argument earlier in the morning, but this time the sound was different, more abrupt and alarming. The dispatcher recorded the call and dispatched a patrol unit. The dispatch log shows the time of arrival as 17. The Officers Johnson and Hale, parked their car at the curb in front of the house. At first glance, the house appeared quiet. The windows were closed. The door was ajar a few inches. The officers knocked and announced themselves loudly, but there was no answer. Johnson opened the door and went inside, Hale remaining behind to cover the entrance. The house was stale and heavy. The first thing they noticed was the absence of people in the living room and kitchen. In the hallway leading to the bedrooms, a mug of spilled coffee lay on the floor. The liquid had not yet soaked into the carpet, indicating that something had happened recently. Further along, on a shelf by the wall, was Margaret's mobile phone. It was switched on, the screen showing an unfinished number dialed. The door to the grandmother's bedroom was open. The bed was unmade, and there were no signs of sleep on it. The officers quickly searched the room but found no one. When they checked Linda's room, the door was locked. No one responded to knocks or police commands. After several warnings, the officers used force. Johnson knocked the lock out with his shoulder. Inside were Linda and Michael. According to the officer's report, they were sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall. Linda was pale. Her hands were shaking. Michael looked confused, not understanding what was happening. Neither of them said a word. In the far corner of the room, partially covered by a cabinet, lay an object later identified as the murder weapon. Officers seized it and recorded its location. At that moment, an ambulance crew arrived at the house, having been called through the central control panel. The paramedics went into the living room and headed towards the kitchen, where they found a woman on the floor with no signs of life. According to the medical report, death occurred at least an hour before the police arrived. Officers Johnson and Hale immediately placed tape around the house. Linda and Michael were escorted to a patrol car for transport to the station. Linda was read her rights, to which she responded with a curt yes. The investigation team arrived at 09:46. Detective Chief Inspector Foster led the inspection. Photographs were taken of each room. The position of furniture, objects, and any visible marks were recorded. Particular attention was paid to the hallway where the coffee mug had been located and the kitchen where signs of a struggle were found. During the initial survey of neighbors, it was established that on the night of April 12, 2013, none of them heard loud sounds except for the morning quarrel. The neighbor who made the call specified that at about 08:50, she heard a short scream of a female voice, then a sharp knock, after which there was silence. Michael was quiet during the transport to the station, occasionally looking in Linda's direction, but never speaking. Linda kept an emotionless expression on her face, sometimes lowering her head and closing her eyes. The official registration of the detention began at the station. Linda was placed in a separate cell, Michael in a temporary holding facility with constant surveillance. Investigators planned to interrogate Linda in the presence of a lawyer. By midday, the Henson home was completely sealed off. The county crime lab was still working inside. Personal belongings, Linda's notebooks, electronic devices, and surveillance footage from neighboring homes were seized. According to Detective Chief Inspector Foster, the situation inside the house indicated a long-term, escalating conflict that had reached an acute stage. It was necessary to establish how and under what circumstances Linda's actions led to Margaret's death, as well as Michael's role in what was happening. This stage of the investigation did not yet provide answers to the main questions, but it already clearly showed that behind the external silence and isolation of the Henson house, there was a difficult life isolated from the outside world, which ultimately ended in tragedy.